Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. It is such a joy to be here with you today on this beautiful snowy morning. We are recording on January 29th here in the Rabbi Chiel Sanctuary, and the recording will be played on the 1st of February. Hard to believe we're jumping into a new month. Today we're talking about something that is so important, especially at the beginning of the year. We all think about how we'd like to change. What are the behaviors we'd like to modify? What are the ways that we want to live into this new year with new strength, new health, new potential? And one of the interesting things is that social science has worked for years and years to uncover the secrets to unlock our best potential and to unlock the ways that we can change behaviors that we don't want. But that success has really plateaued. Even though we know what it takes to be healthy, what it takes for us to live our best lives, so often we make the choices that are directly antithetical to our best interests. So how do we shift this? How do we do the work to become our best selves and overcome the behaviors that are preventing our best potential? Today we're going to look at the Exodus story, at Pharaoh's own struggles with encountering potential and then dashing it with his own stubbornness, and at the possibilities of our tradition and social research to help us. We'll begin, as always, with a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzaenu v'tze'etzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai notein ha'Torah. So I just want to start with a couple of founding ideas. I shared in the teaser that there's such a fascinating thing. When my grandparents were both very, very heavy smokers, and they both said, like, if we had known what smoking could do to our lungs and what it would do to our lives, we would never have started. And it was very difficult for them to quit. And they could never understand how it is that young people today who grew up with the training about the problems of smoking would start smoking, and that there's a constant number. There's still 1.1 billion smokers, and experts estimate that that number will remain constant until at least 2025, probably longer. There's no indication that that's abating, even though worldwide we know smoking is so bad for you. And I was looking at this fascinating study, Temporal Immediacy, by Professors Cook, Schmieg, Reeder, Horton, Deutsch, Lowe, and Meek. And they raise this fascinating research, which is that social sciences, i.e., there's been lots of different research into what allows us to change. And interestingly, in a 2003 study, Ogden found that predictive, the theory of planned behavior, that is, there's this idea that if you have an attitude that you have the potential to change, an awareness of your own power to change that behavior and an appreciation for the change of that behavior, that you can change your behavior. It's something that I think all of us subscribe to. All of us believe that if we want to change something, if we want to change our behavior, we can. But in this study, they found that the theory of planned behavior is only predictive when people said they would not change. If they said they were going to change, it was no better than chance. So this is just such a fascinating reality that we think we have the potential to change, and yet so often we can't. So I want to look at Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has this fascinating relationship between his direct lived experience and then what happens after the experience. In the moment, he's able to make really clear choices, and once the experience fades, it goes away and he forgets. So, Michelle, would you read our first biblical text? I've just got a couple of the plagues for us to read. We are on page 6 of the handout. Exodus
Then
chapter 8.
Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Plead with Hashem to remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go and sacrifice to God." And Moses said to Pharaoh, "You may have this triumph over me, For what time shall I plead on behalf of you and your courtiers and your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses, to remain only in the Nile? For tomorrow, he replied. And Moses said, as you say, that you may know that there is none like our God. The frogs shall retreat from you and your courtiers and your people, and they shall remain only in the Nile. Then Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moses cried out to God in the matter of the frogs, which had been inflicted upon Pharaoh. And Hashem did as Moses asked. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they piled up in heaps till the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he became stubborn and would not heed them, as Hashem had spoken.
Great. We're going to go for two more examples, and then I want to talk about it. Dan, would you take Exodus chapter 8, verses 20 and through 28?
Sure. And Adonai did so. Heavy swarms of insects invaded Pharaoh's palace and the houses of his courtiers. Throughout the country of Egypt, the land was ruined because of the swarms of insects. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go and sacrifice to your God within the land." But Moses replied, It would not be right to do this, for what we sacrifice to our God, Adonai, is untouchable to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice that which is untouchable to the Egyptians before their very eyes, will they not stone us? So we must go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness and sacrifice to Adonai as our God may command us. Pharaoh said, I will let you go to sacrifice to your God Adonai in the wilderness, but do not go very far. Plead then for me. And Moses said, When I leave your presence, I will plead with Adonai that the swarms of insects depart tomorrow from Pharaoh and his courtiers and his people. But let not Pharaoh again act deceitfully, not letting the people go to sacrifice to Adonai. So Moses left Pharaoh's presence and pleaded with Adonai, and Adonai did as Moses asked, removing the swarms of insects from Pharaoh, from his courtiers, and from his people. Not one remained. But Pharaoh became stubborn this time also, and would not let the people go.
Again, the direct experience fades, he forgets, he changes behavior. Last, will you read our final Exodus chapter 9? I could have brought others, but on page 7, the final biblical text.
Yes. The hail was very heavy, fire flashing in the midst of the hail, such as had not fallen on the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout the land of Egypt, the hails struck down all that were in the open, both human and beast. The hail also struck down all the grasses of the field and shattered all the trees of the field. Only in the region of Goshen, where the Israelites were, there was no hail. Thereupon Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron and said to them, I stand guilty this time. Adonai is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Plead with Adonai that there may have been an end of God's thunder and of hail. I will let you go. You need to say no longer. Moses said to him, as I go out of the city, I shall, turning page, spread out my hands to Adonai. The thunder will cease and the hail will fall no more, so that you may know that the earth is Adonai. But I know that you and your how do you pronounce that? Courtiers. Thank you. Do not yet fear God. Now the flax and barley were ruined, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bag. But the wheat and the emmer, kind of wheat, were not hurt, for they ripened late. Leaving Pharaoh, Moses went outside the city and spread out his hands to Adonai. The thunder and the hail ceased, and no rain came pouring down upon the earth. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he became stubborn and reverted to his guilty ways, as did his courtiers.
So how do you understand this? In the midst of plague, Pharaoh understands, he repents, and then the bodies of the frogs and the animals are all rotting, and they're still before him, and yet, in the absence of that immediate experience, he changes course. How do you understand that?
So I was actually struck by the idea that you framed in your introduction about, and sort of revisited right here, that somehow Pharaoh has the true insight, has the true self desire, which is expressed during the pressure of the plague, but otherwise Pharaoh is not acting in his own interest, because I see it exactly the opposite, right? And that's kind of borne out when later God hardens Pharaoh's heart, giving him kind of that extra boost of what's in Pharaoh's interest. Pharaoh's interest, his willpower, his efforts are directed towards preserving his own stature and preserving his sense of authority with his people. And it is actually during the plague that his willpower vis-a-vis that is broken, and he reclaims it when the pressure of the plague is gone. You could see it in that way. And my children and I had a really interesting discussion. One of the very challenging pieces of this Torah text is when God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And you have to ask the question, why? Why does that happen? How does that happen? Is that fair? Is that equitable? What are we supposed to understand from the story in that moment? And in a sense, if you look at Pharaoh's starting position as his place of his rational mind and the break in his willpower as the plagues, perhaps in that hardening of Pharaoh's heart, God is restoring the equilibrium to allow Pharaoh to make his rational decisions. So I feel like in a sense we're reversed here, and yet I appreciate the use of the metaphor to try to apply to our own lives. I'm not entirely sure that it 100% fits, because for most of us, when we're grappling, say your example with smoking, something is right, but there's some other system that is at work. Whereas in this case, the thing that Pharaoh knows is right is actually overcome by the plagues.
But I find that
even
so
though we know it's
fascinating,
wrong,
because I'm not sure that actually having all of those slaves and creating that kind of society is actually in Pharaoh's best interest. Like, I hear you saying that he believes his best interest is to preserve this kind of kingdom where he has all these slaves and he has all this free labor and he's able to preserve his status through this slave labor. However, I would argue that's actually not in Pharaoh's best interest.
1,000%.
It's like the equivalent of smoking for his society. Like, he has a health behavior for his community that causes long-term national damage, even though it has immediate satisfaction.
I have a slightly different view. He's like a dictator, okay? And dictators love themselves to begin with, and they believe that everything they do is perfect, okay? So I don't think that having slaves and cheap labor and everything is against Pharaoh's interest. He preserves his power. He says, I'm the king, and nobody is here to contradict me. And when this God of whoever these people are, that's we, it's, he's not powerful enough. It's like, yeah, he brings this froggy, and it's a little cutie, we can sing songs about the froggy. But it's not something that I have fear. And basically, okay, I'll make these people happy, but it's against his will and against his own beliefs.
I want to take it up one level. Actually, Pharaoh doesn't think he's king; he thinks he's God, and so he thinks he's God, and so therefore the struggle that's going on is that another God is coming into trying to replace him. So in his own best interest, he has to continue to show that he is in charge, that he is God, and that all of these plagues that God is bringing are against other deities in the Egyptian society. And frogs were considered deities in some ways. That they had also, magical powers.
What stands out for me is this idea that what happens when you do something, but you are not convinced at all, and you end up doing something against your own will. And you act as if you are convinced.
And that's why, to me, the fascinating question that you've raised is, like, where is the locus of willpower? If you graft it on to the article that you shared about the temporal immediacy, right? Where are we locating the breakdown in Pharaoh's willpower between his rational mind and his instinctual mind?
So I just want to summarize, because I think it's so fascinating. So I have this strong sense that Pharaoh, in the immediacy of the plague, has access to his heart and has access to truth in a new way. And then once the plague recedes, he reverts to this narrative theory in which, according to this article, but this idea, this story that he makes up about the world, that he doesn't need to make change and that he's going to continue with a behavior that causes health problems. The three of you, I hear you saying that you actually have the opposite, which is that Pharaoh is living in alignment with his best interests, with the best interests of his nation.
With what he perceives to be his best interests.
And the plagues are a momentary interruption in that story. And then he returns to his true values and to his true, what honestly lives. So that the plagues are actually this narrative moment where he makes up a story, but then he comes back to his truth.
Right. And because otherwise you have a really even more profound challenge with the question, why does God harden his heart?
Why is that? Why do you have a more profound challenge with the question?
Because I think if you say that Pharaoh's rational mind for himself is acting in his narrative structure, is acting in accordance with his will. We disagree with it. We think it's bad for him, but he's fully comfortable with that. And then the plagues come and break that for him. Suddenly he's in his sort of more primitive mind. Oh my gosh, how do we get out of this? He capitulates. But then as soon as the pressure is off, he's back in his rational, his own rational state, although we would call that irrational. Nevertheless, I think, therefore, there's some argument that God's hardening his heart, whether you agree with this or disagree, is in order to align, to bring Pharaoh's capacity for understanding his rational mind back to him, right?
Because so in other words, God is acting to strengthen Pharaoh, not to prevent him from getting to a higher truth.
Because, well, look, I mean, there are arguments that God is simply saying, I am God and I'm doing this. And no matter what you do, Pharaoh, I have this plan. There are 10 plagues. We're just going to do all of them. There's another argument that is put forward very strongly by the rabbinic commentators that sort of after a certain point, when you have made the same decision again and again and again, you kind of lose the capacity to make a different decision. You are no longer, a victim who has made bad decisions. You're now a person who embodies the decisions that you make. They come to be you. Whereas I think in your way, if you imagine that, there's this greater good and Pharaoh's real self is the one that he uncovers and discovers at the plague, but he loses that immediately, trying to make the parallel to somebody who might be addicted to smoking or something, right? Like my real self really wants to do those things. Then God coming in to harden his heart is actually interfering with his personal growth.
Which I like that read, because I actually think that God understands this other challenge, which is God is doing this theater, say, in Egypt for the purpose of teaching Bnei Israel, which we see later on. Bnei Israel also struggles with what Pharaoh struggles with, right? When God is not immediately performing signs and wonders, Bnei Israel is like, God, wasn't it better to be back there? Shouldn't we have gone back there? Actually, we're going to make a golden calf. Actually, we're going to do this. Like, they have all these moments of rebellion. And God has this determination to see the whole production through in the hopes that God's going to be able to inspire a kind of faith. And to me, I don't see God as being like, Pharaoh, I love you and I just want to lift up your highest potential and I want you to have the economy that you want and the nation that you want. I really want to reinforce that strength of character that's going to enable you to continue pushing down this people in order to have the kind of world that you want.
So can I say something? Since I was a kid, I never believed this narrative that the God of the Jewish people can make Pharaoh, who believes in other gods, his heart hard, all right? Because he has a set of beliefs and this God is nothing to me. So this capacity that our God has over, this is like a very monotheistic belief that there is only one God, but in those days there were. So I see it a little different, and I'm going to put it in a funny way. When you may experience this in the future, when you have toddlers, all right? And they are testing your boundaries, all right? And suppose they take a toy and they are playing and they decided to throw it, away. And you said, Heather, please don't do that.
We've never had this experience.
No, okay, David, never do that. Don't do that. You are going to, first of all, you can hurt somebody. And second, you're going to destroy the toy. And then he continues playing, and he looks at you, and he does it again. All right? And then you give him another opportunity, and then it comes to an end. And in the case of the Jewish people, Pharaoh will say, okay, go. You made me tired, just go. But in the case of the kids, you say, okay, that's it. You know, go to your room, and you are done for the day. You don't play anymore. So that makes to me this idea that God hardened, Pharaoh's heart. You become like, that's it. I'm sick of it. I'm tired of this. I don't want these people anymore. And I don't want these froggies and all this stuff. The hell. That's it. I'm not in a different place. No more opportunities for them.
But in the end, Elias,
It's the desert and worship your own God, damn it.
but it is even worse. It is even worse because at the end, Pharaoh lets the people go, but he doesn't. Then the death of the firstborn can't even bother him enough to let the people leave. Then he has to chase them.
That explains my theory.
Yeah.
That you even said it, that he believes he's God.
Yeah.
That he's an authoritarian and he only cares about him.
Exactly. So it takes his death and the death of the entire Egyptian army to end it, and it never really he never comes to a resolution. He never changes his heart. He never grows. And the question is, whether God doesn't allow him to grow, or whether God gives him the capacity to grow and he doesn't at various times. That's more complex.
I was going to say, I want to bring us back because I want to come back to, there's a couple of ideas that are brought, and this study is so fascinating. I found the study of temporal mediacy to just be such a fascinating investigation into how we might modify our behavior. And they introduce in the background of the study sort of two theories of how we think. And one of the theories is Plato's metaphor of the two horses, which is that every person is driving a chariot and you have two horses, one that's like the best horse you could ever buy, that's noble and beautiful and strong and always goes in the right direction and stops when you want it to stop and goes when you want it to go and requires no direction, and one that's a terrible horse that goes always in the wrong direction, always needs to be whipped and pulled and modified and blah 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 blah, and your chariot is constantly divided between these two horses. And of course, Jewishly, we have this idea of the Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara, which our rabbis explain that we have this good self that's always thinking of our highest interest, and we have this Yetzer Hara, which is they describe as the base interest, like your physicality, your body's interest that's moving from base interest, and you need both of them. I love the Jewish understanding because you need both of them in order to build a house and build a family. You have to have a Yetzer Hara, but you certainly need a Yetzer HaTov to do right. And I want to ask you, do you think this maps on to Pharaoh, this idea of the two chariots? And if so, how? How do you see his Yetzer HaTov, Yetzer Hara operating in this instance where he concedes and then holds back to his original perspective?
Yeah, I love that metaphor. So, of course, in the Jewish tradition, they are balanced. We hope the Yetzer HaTov will be, 50.1% as opposed to 49.49%, right? 99%. So it seems that in Pharaoh's case, the Yetzer Hara just has that 0.1%, enough to put him over the edge, if we want to use that Jewish metaphor.
So you see him, and this is, so we're scratching he's acting in his best interest, and you see him as, when he says, no, come back, it's Yetzer Hara taking back over. Mm-hmm. But when he's letting the people go, it's his Yetzer HaTov, his good self, allowing him to be kind and open-hearted.
No, not necessarily. I was just really kind of reacting to the Jewish metaphor. But I think I more stand with the idea that that in the end he's really only about himself. And
I don't see this is a beautiful teaching, but I enlighten me with the idea that there is Yetzer HaTov in Pharaoh. Where and when? So I don't see.
That's why I think it's an uneasy graft, right? It's a little bit of a challenge. I love where you're taking us, right? This exploration of our own struggle, and I think that both the horses and the later psychological sort of paradigms that they choose to try to understand what everybody intuitively experiences in their own hearts, I think are very helpful. And very helpful models as we think about our own struggles with the things that we want to do and know we should do. And then there's the piece that the want to do is a completely different direction than the rational want to do. And so I love this, the studies. And I don't know that the graft rests well on Pharaoh. It might rest a little better on Moses himself, in the sense of, Moses' struggle that we've discussed here in class about coming before Pharaoh. Like, how do I gain the courage? How do I stand up by my convictions? How do I do the thing that's really hard to do? Feels like much more Moses' story to me. Pharaoh, maybe because even though he has a lot of ink spilled about him in these chapters, is not a fully actualized character. He's the villain, right? And so I would agree with you. It's hard to see where Pharaoh's struggle even is, other than that he bows to the pressure that God puts on him with the plagues.
So this is a piece I totally hear, and I wanted to say love when we have disagreements. It just is, it feels such a fascinating conversation. But I fundamentally don't understand the read of Pharaoh as acting in his own best interest and in the national interest of Egypt when he refuses to let the Israelites go, given the plagues and the immediate and intensive effects of the plagues on his people, on the economy, on the future. Like, it feels to me like this is a Yetzer HaTov, Yetzer Hara moment where he's actually, his base need to be great and to have power exceeds his ability to recognize what is good for everyone around him.
Yes,
Alisa,
right? So
question
that's
for you.
actually, you just spoke exactly into the place where the difference of the opinion in reading Pharaoh is, right? Because you said, how can you say that he's acting in his own best interest and in his nation's best interest? I think at least the three of us here are in some agreement as to Pharaoh, as the leader, is actually not that concerned about the welfare of his nation, right? He sometimes is, but mostly he's centered in what's good for the king.
But
So
it's
the
not
Yetzer-
what's good for the king. That's the thing. Like, what's good for the nation is what's good for the king. This is
Alisa,
what I
I
don't
have-
We would
I have a
say
question.
that.
But he should too. Yes.
I have a question,
Yes, please bring your question.
because I want to describe a situation, then I ask a question to all of you. So basically, the last we learn about the story is that, Pharaoh says to the Jewish people and to Moses, you can go now, all right? But as soon as they leave, they go after them,
Right, exactly.
okay? And the famous story is that when the Israelites cross the sea, and then the Egyptians come, it's closed, and so basically, what happened to the Yetzer HaTov there? It wasn't like, go, I don't want anything to do with you. No, go. But after that, he changes his mind. He's, I'm going to destroy these people. I'm going to kill them all when
Is
they are
it
in
kill or bring them back? Because I think those are two
Right.
distinct.
So the question becomes to me, what triumphs at the end? In a person or in people, it's the Yetzer HaTov or the Yetzer Hara. And that's how you finally end up judging a character.
Yeah, there's this great little midrash in there in that moment when the sea falls back in, that picks out the fact that the wheels of the Egyptian chariots are stuck in the mud, and so all the Egyptians
You watch the Mel Brooks
drown.
movies.
No, but it's actually in the Torah.
We got it
That definitely, because the wheels are stuck, the Egyptians drown. And there's this beautiful little midrashic point that their wheels are stuck, but their legs still work, right? Like, they could make a different choice about where they're going in that moment. And so I want to kind of circle back to where you're trying to get us to that question of where is our personal choice and our willpower, and where is that battle between our wheels and our legs here.
So thank you so much for that. I'm going to invite you to read, please, because I want to go into, we've all been sort of alluding to it along the way, but I want to read Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's thinking from his book Thinking Fast and Slow. We're on page 3. And if you could read the paragraph, an important recent revisioning.
An important recent revisioning of Plato's theory of mind comes from Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, whose book, Thinking Fast and Slow, popularized the idea that people have two separate minds. System one, which we label the intuitive system, is a set of effortlessly originating impressions and feelings that has freewheeling impulses and associations and operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. By contrast, system two, which we label the narrative system, allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, and is associated with a subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. Kahneman argued that only the slower narrative system constructs thoughts in an orderly series of steps, whereas the intuitive system is driven by a heuristic, decision, rules, and cognitive biases. There are clearly parallels here to Plato's two horses, two influences on behavior, one rational and the other not, pulling in different directions. However, there are also important differences from Plato's ideas. First, although the intuitive system is often described as the...
We're going to pause there because I think that's enough for us to think about this difference between this intuitive and I would label it intuitive like the immediate processing of your surrounding environments, your gut, your jerk, your sort of like impulse reaction, and this narrative, which is the story that I make about what happened and the beliefs that I build after that. And so I want to ask us to think about how is that operate, those two modes. This is not that there's a good and there's a bad. This is that I have an immediate response to the things that are happening around me versus I go back home, I think about it, I create a new narrative, I have a new story, and therefore I'm able to do something different.
Yeah, I'm laughing because of two reasons. First of all, this is exactly the teachings that I do, and most of you, I'm sure you do, when we explain Tefillim to the kids. That there is one in the mind and the other one pointing to the heart, that we have to try a balance between the two. You know, our heart, the immediate passion, and I'm laughing because I'm Latino and I have a lot of that. I don't look Latino, but I'm Latino. And then the heart, you know, cold mind and relax a little bit, think a little bit carefully. It's really beautiful. And I don't know who was based on what, if the Tefillim on this guy or this guy on the Tefillim, but I found it so beautiful. Yes.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about like in a personal way, you know, how like I have specific goals and I know what my goals are. I know what I need to do, and yet in the moment, like, you know, okay, so I'm having a bad day, for example. All right, and I know that I'm working on losing weight, and I'm having a bad day, so I go to Dunkin' Donuts and get 2 donuts, right, instead of like not even having a donut at all, right? So that's the kind of like, you know, that's the visceral behavior, the in the moment behavior, and then someone will say, well, yeah, but you know, I am working on losing weight. I'm still working on that, just for the moment. And then like 3 days later, I'm doing the same thing. Just, you know, so that momentary need overtaking.
Well, and it's not just the
rational goal.
momentary need, right? What you're describing is that the immediate pleasure
Yes.
overtakes the narrative, the long-term goal, the long-term ideology and thinking, because your immediate experience is prioritized over the long-term arcing narrative.
Right. Exactly.
Possibly, and we could go into a much longer conversation about this, but one of the interesting things that's picked out in the next paragraph is about the important strengths that come about from each of those systems, and the fact that we each actually have a set point for various things. And the Musar tradition really captures this beautifully, sort of a pre-psychological, deeply religious tradition that imagines our working on our attributes for ourselves, that each of us come into this world with a particular set point. Some things that are going to be hard for me are not hard for you, and the opposite is true. And so we're each working within a particular sphere of what's available to us. I think, you know, one of the classes that my kids had at school was biological basis for behavior. And that they're coming to understand much, much more that that's actually a truism, right? For your grandparents who were addicted to smoking, right? That actually now drives their choices in a similar way to Pharaoh's hardened heart, right? The sense that once you have that set point, there's a certain kind of recalibration to a mean that we see happening again and again with Pharaoh in the Torah, and I think is the echo of something important that we're only just beginning to discover in modern science, which is that people have different strengths and capacities and abilities within a particular range that they can grow within that range, but it may take here in this lovely article, they talk about the stressors on the system. It may take some stressors on the system to make radical change.
And I want to say within the language of Kahneman, what you're talking about is the transition between intuitive behavior and narrative. And once you have gotten from the intuitive experience to a narrative reality, where you've built a story and an ideology and a set of practice, it's very hard to get back into intuitive experience and very hard to change that.
And also, I think the Musar system would posit that, like, if something's really easy for you, you're not going to spend 5 years working on it. Whereas if something's really hard for you, that's where you focus.
I think also the piece where Kahneman meets Musar is that Musar says, we're going to do work to disentangle, as you were saying, we're going to disentangle your intuitive experience from your narrative process. We're going to create a pause point whereby you can reframe your direct experience of the world and thereby create a different narrative reaction. I'm a very volatile, angry person. And like I'm on the road and I get really irate and I'm just behind the wheel and I'm cursing everybody and I'm screaming and I'm honking.
You're not describing me, right? It's very Spanish, so nobody understands what I'm saying.
But like your lived experience is you get in the car and your intuitive reality is that you're angry and you respond with that anger. Musar would say, I'm going to practice patience. I'm going to practice kindness. I'm going to practice forbearance, whatever the Musar is that you're working on. And so in that moment, you pause in your experience. You try to bring in a different experience. You're trying to bring in a competing reality that's going to help you to change your narrative and change your reaction. And so I might be like, okay, patience, forbearance, kindness, aware. I'm going to say this chant, and that's going to then help me to change my narrative reality. And I think that's so fascinating. I think that tradition has a really different response to this. And this is where I think the most powerful teaching in our Parsha this week comes with, I would say, an application of Kahneman's thinking about intuitive versus narrative theory on how we actually change behavior. So what we've learned, if we're really taking this study and all the studies that they cite seriously, is that and we didn't even need these studies to know. We know that change is really hard. Like when you want to make a change and you want to make a lifestyle change, you want to change your children's behavior, you want to change your own behavior, it's brutally hard, and more often than not, we're unsuccessful. And whether that's about a competition between Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Hatov, whether that's a competition with the two horses in our chariots, whether that's a competition between our lived experience and the stories that we tell about it and our narrative understanding of our lives, or whether that's like what's actually in our best interest, however you want to understand that, what can we do to shift this? And this is a question God really wants to know, because God's interest is making the Jewish people remember always that God is powerful and be always faithful. And it's a question that we are really interested in. And so what I find so fascinating is that God creates this ritual moment of activating intuitive reality. God doesn't say like, oh, once upon a time this Exodus story happened, once upon a time the plagues happened, and like you'll remember forevermore. Like that's always going to be a part of your narrative, and therefore you'll always remember. No. God says, you've had this experience, but it's not enough to have this experience once. I'm going to create Passover. I'm going to create a ritual every year where you act as though you feel it out. You have an intuitive experience of the Exodus story and actively in the moment create a narrative that's going to change your lived reality. And I just want to ask, like, on the premise, like, is that something that we can do when we're trying to change a behavior? What would it look like? Like, if you're trying to quit smoking, what would it look like to have a ritual Passover of smoking that would enable you? And by the way, this is not just a ritual we do once a year at Passover, though that's the most intensive, and certainly everybody has the groaning of the lack of leavened breads for the whole week, but something that we do every single day. What would the ritual be? And whatever is that behavioral change, do you buy this as a ritual potential for behavioral change? Maybe we've beat the social scientists and we had it already in our tradition.
Well, I think in some ways we're doing that with educational models that have developed over the past like 15, 20 years, where you have much more flexibility with experiential education, not a teacher in front of you, but hands-on education, and that allows for learning and for behavioral maybe modification that helps create a sense of self-worth for a student and an ability to learn in ways that they may not be able to. For example, that's one way to do it.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the, eating matzah and unleavened bread as a, sort of willpower cultivation scheme, mostly. But I mostly thought about it as reliving our story and teaching ourselves the values of that story and each of the metaphors that come out from the experience of puffed up versus leavened and cleaning and all those sorts of things. But I think when we cast it in that realm, I mean, it's obviously true. We refrain from eating these things. It's literally fundamentally true. So if we perceive of it in that way, I wonder if it's about building a culture around us. One of the interesting things that I kind of went down a little rabbit hole here.
You're welcome.
For your article. And one of the interesting things I uncovered was they did the marshmallow study in other cultures. Mm-hmm. And there is one specific culture in Cameroon where they actually had completely different results because their entire culture, from the time that babies are born, is geared towards teaching self-restraint and what we would today call emotional regulation. And I wonder whether in that context, this piece that you brought here at the end is about teaching us some form of emotional regulation, some standard that we set for understanding our own capacity to transcend ourselves.
And, going back with the Pesach story, you know how hard it is not to eat bread for 8 days?
No, I have no idea.
So basically...
I really don't.
Basically, we are, doing self-restraint.
Because I'm gluten-free, just to be clear. Because I'm gluten-free, not because...
And we should finish because we have Shacharit 9:30. We are getting closer to Shacharit. But it's I like this idea. It's a new approach. I never thought about Passover like that. But it's very interesting. And I mean, every day we do choices and we have to restrain ourselves, eating kosher it's a choice, and eating kosher, it's hard at times when you go out with friends and none of them are kosher and they eating stuff in front of you, and it's hard. So it's the Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara, or whatever you want to call it, or the two horses, But I honestly think that this was a wonderful conversation, and thank you for providing all these materials.
I'm so grateful. Thank you all so much. It's been such a joy, and I want to end with a bow. Parshat bow. Very good, Dan. But just a deep prayer for all of us, that learning these texts, that being engaged in the story of our Exodus will enable us to find our own redemption story, from the immediacy and the intensity of our lived experience to the power and potential of the narratives that we create, and the hopes that all together we can create a better, more healthy, more happy, more whole world. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.